Hi everybody, welcome back to another video about an article for MU 518. And in this video I'm going to give an overview of Stephen Bruns' article in Stilo Mahleriano, I guess you could say, in quotation and allusion in the music of George Crumb. This article touches a lot about different quotation and allusion in a lot of Crumb's pieces, so it should give you a little more context for some of the quotations in Black Angels itself. I've got a handout here that I will post very soon on Canvas. And then I also have a link here on the handout to this page. It's simply Stephen Bruns' faculty profile page at University of Colorado. You can see all the things that I put on the handout I got right from here about his degrees from the University of Wisconsin, and the fact that he is a George Crumb scholar. I know he does other work, but I believe that that's what he's best known for, is his Crumb. The article I find to be pretty pleasant to read. I hope you feel the same way. I think Bruns is a really clear writer, and it helps give a lot more background information on why Crumb enjoys quotation so much and how it works in his other music. So on my handout I've got some key points. One is just noting that Crumb quotes music of other composers often, especially Mahler, and especially during this period of 1963 to 1974. So that's what the article focuses on, is that time period. And you'll note that 63 to 74 includes the time when Black Angels was written in 1969 and 70. The most common references that Bruns observes are to Mahler, Bartók, and Haydn, sometimes quotations, and sometimes just references or allusions or parody. With Mahler, we'll see a lot of examples in this article. With Bartók, part of what he's referring to are times when Crumb references night music or calls something night music, because Bartók famously created this style that shows up in many of his pieces that is called night music. So when Crumb does that, it's a very overt allusion to Bartók. With Haydn, he does more kind of allusion than direct quotation, or a reference, or more than a quotation. We know that at the end of Black Angels, there is a moment where he notes "in tempore belli" at the end of the score, noting that he wrote that piece in the time of the Vietnam War. That is a reference to Haydn having written Missa in tempore belli, that is a mass in time of war. It's a very direct reference. And this is what I mean when I've said in other videos that I think Crumb really loves classical music. He loves the canon, he loves other composers, he loves Western music. What he's doing is not ever, I think, trying to get away from the canon, destroy the canon, anything like that. It's more just sort of reimagining how one listens to that music. Absent from this list, I will note, is Debussy, who we also know that Crumb really loved and wanted to sometimes quote and sometimes just allude to. So that will come up in another reading that we do this semester, probably. I say probably in case I ever change that aspect of this course, but I really like assigning this piece of writing by Robert Cook, and the article is all about Debussy and syrinx and Crumb's use of that syrinx in this other piece about nature and how they go together and so on. I believe Crumb was also interested in references to Messiaen, and I think we've talked a little bit about that in terms of the God music of Black Angels and the fifth movement of the Quartet for the End of Time, and I think that relationship is strong. He also quotes and references his own music. So in the article, Bruns talks about 11 Echoes of Autumn and the fact that it and night music both return as references and quotations in Echoes of Time in the River, which you can see on page 14 here, he completed in winter of 1967. Those two pieces of his are also closely related, and I think echoing sounds are really common in a lot of his pieces, so that's like a motivic or sort of sonic reference, almost more of a timbral reference, that happens throughout his output. Bruns also makes a point about this score of 11 Echoes of Autumn, where you can see the quotations, but also the fact that it's a circular score is important, because so many of his pieces have these visual components, and circular scores are a big theme in a lot of different music of his. They show up in Macrocosmos, they show up in parts of American Songbook, they manifest in just a bunch of different places. His music is past-oriented, as Bruns explains, and I think that's really true. And Bruns makes this great list of all the places where that's likely to show up in his music, so definitely in titles, calling something night music. In the form itself, that palindrome form is something that I think he's interested in general, symmetrical forms, or in having one of his pieces mimic the form of another person's piece. In terms of tonality and instrumentation, Bruns talks a lot about the mandolin and its relationship to the Mahler later in the article. In terms of notation, like I was talking about with the circle, although other shapes also appear where there are references or there are commonalities between different graphic scores, and poetic imagery certainly. I mean, we've talked about that a lot so far with Crumb. Motivic structure and theatrical effects are things that show up in a lot of his pieces, but they tie them together because of how he'll use the same one across multiple pieces. I made this list based on a couple of places in the article where Bruns names things that Crumb does that he has in common with Mahler. So, for example, asking a player to play off stage is a similar effect, something that Mahler would have players do as well. And Crumb does that with some frequency across his career. Specific sonorities or intervals, he mentions at one point. The use of sleigh bells in his orchestration. And then the texts, the Lorca poem and then Das Lied von der Erde. And I wanted to look at this page, 23, where he really makes this side-by-side comparison between Das Lied von der Erde and Night of the Four Moons. So we have a similarity in voice, although Crumb's, of course, has extended techniques. We have text that has to do with the sun in the Mahler, and here we have something to do with the moon. And you get the sense that like Crumb read this poem and it reminded him of the Mahler, and that gives him a starting point for how to conceive of this piece and how to conceive of the text, how to interpret the text. So then we notice that the alto flute in the Mahler, or the alto flute in the Crumb, is probably related to the flute in the Mahler, plucked strings, etc. Mahler uses the mandolin, and Crumb uses the banjo, which have the fact in common that they are not orchestral instruments. They're both associated with folk or indigenous music. They both are plucked or strummed in the manner of a guitar, which is different from how a lot of other string instruments are played in orchestra settings, aside from pizzicato. You can see here where Bruns is drawing attention to the Ewig motive and saying that that same motive shows up in the Crumb piece, and then other percussion instruments that they also have in common. So tam-tams, cymbals, glockenspiel, a lot of really ringing metallic percussion, which is something that I think Crumb favors just in general. But I do think that's significant that they're so similar in this piece. And then notice where he takes the title of this article from this indication in the vibraphone at that moment, off stage, and it says farewell music as berceuse, and a berceuse is like a lullaby in Stilo Mahleriano, so that's where the title of this article comes from, that score indication in Crumb. Crumb's score indications, I think, are just so important, and it's something that with a lot of other composers' works, music theorists tend not to take into account, but you have to take it into account when interpreting Crumb, because he leaves so much information in those score indications about the setting or about how to play something or its connection to another piece, such as the Mahleriano. I wanted to note also Crumb's comment here about quotation, because I have quoted this quote myself. The idea is, what he says is, well, it's intuitive, but trying to articulate it, I would say that quotation can produce different effects. Nostalgia for a past world, or a strange spanning of time, by juxtaposing something that was written 2 centuries earlier with something new. I'm really attracted to this quote because it's so directly about nostalgia. And at one point, Bruns talks about how these quotations are like Crumb remembering Mahler. And I think that's exactly right. I think Crumb's music is so tied to his experience of remembering and memory. And what does it mean to remember something? And when you remember it, it changes a little bit. And so his version of Mahler will change a little bit. I found this other thing about quotation that I cite in my book about how Mahler and Crumb is different from Mahler and Mahler. I think it was actually quoting or it was actually referring to the composer Zimmermann, and it said something like Bach, and Zimmermann is different from Bach in Bach. And Mahler in Crumb is different from Mahler. In Mahler, it's different. You remember it differently, you hear it differently. It might make you think of Mahler, but it doesn't necessarily trigger like maybe specific moments, but maybe it makes you think of a time when you heard Mahler, and maybe some of the associations you have with Mahler. Those things get layered on top of each other then with the Crumb. So for my discussion questions, I start by asking, do you hear programmatic associations in certain instruments or quotes, even if Crumb didn't specify them? Because at one point, Bruns talks about how Crumb didn't want a very specific program to go with some of these things, like the imitation of the bells in Mahler. And I understand that, but I also think that he's just trying not to be too specific because it's limiting. I don't think that he hears it in this like totally neutral way. I don't think he conceives of music like that in a neutral way. I think he's just trying to leave it open to interpretation, but it's not open to anything. It still has like a specific programmatic context. But you can talk about that for yourself, like what programmatic associations might you hear, even if Crumb doesn't specify them. Then I ask, what does Bruns mean that these works share a spirit of existential loneliness? He's talking about Crumb and Mahler there, and that is something that I think we associate with Mahler. So if Crumb is drawing on that, then like, what does it sort of mean in that context, and what is that spirit of existential loneliness? How does that manifest in Crumb's pieces? Finally, name another piece that uses quotation by a different composer. You can name anybody you want. Include a link to it if you don't mind, so that we can all look at it. And how does that person use quotation differently than Crumb does, or how might quotation function differently in another composer's piece than it does for Crumb? You know, for Crumb, if it's all about nostalgia and memory, but maybe for another composer, the quotation does something else. Maybe it has a different role. So that's worth thinking about. So that's what I have for you. It's a very brief outline of the Bruns article. Feel free to touch on anything in the article also that you just want to comment on, or if you have any questions about it, you can post them in the discussion or you can let me know. Bye for now.